All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to dig into something that's pretty vital for any organization out there.
Yeah, no matter what they do or how big they are. We're talking about enterprise risk management, or ERM for short.
ERM, basically understanding what could trip you up, but also those unexpected opportunities that might pop up along the way.
Exactly. It's about seeing the whole picture, all those potential challenges, and how to navigate them.
So, for our listeners, today's about getting a grip on how organizations handle all that uncertainty.
Right. And we've got some great source material today that breaks down three big pieces of this whole ERM thing: operational risk, project risk, and supply chain risk.
A detailed look at each one. So, think of this as a crash course on these core ideas. We'll pull out the most important insights from this article.
And this is relevant for anyone, really. It's not just for businesses. Nonprofits, government agencies, they all have to grapple with uncertainty.
Okay, so let's break this down, starting with operational risk management. What's that all about?
Operational risk management, well, it's how an organization goes about identifying, assessing, monitoring, and trying to reduce the risks that pop up in their everyday work.
You mean like those things that can throw a wrench in the works?
Yeah, things that affect their efficiency and can lead to financial losses, their internal processes, systems, people, but also external events. All that's in the mix.
So, keeping things running smoothly, minimizing the chance of things going wrong, and being able to bounce back quickly when they do.
Exactly. It's a structured way to look at all those routines and processes and figure out where the vulnerabilities are.
Okay, give me an example. What kind of vulnerabilities?
Think system outages.
Yeah.
Or human errors. Those always happen.
Right.
And then inefficiencies, or even not complying with rules and regulations.
So how do they get a handle on all this? What tools are we talking about?
Well, risk assessments are a big one. Pinpointing those vulnerabilities.
Makes sense.
Then you've got process audits. Are things being done right, efficiently?
Mhm.
And then key risk indicators, KRIs. Think of those as an early warning system.
Got it. So they've identified the risks, then what? How do they actually deal with them?
Putting controls and responses in place, that can mean a lot of things, actually. From training programs for employees to fixing the processes themselves.
Yeah.
Automation can help reduce human error. And having contingency plans, those backup plans. Super important for when things go south.
Because they will.
They always do. And the article emphasizes this: continuous refinement.
You mean not just a one-time thing?
Exactly. Regular checks on those controls, learning from incidents when they do happen, the constant cycle of improvement.
Always learning. Okay, so the article then shifts gears a bit and focuses on the financial industry.
Right.
How is operational risk management different for them?
The interesting thing here is how the definition of operational risk is really broadened. For financial institutions, it's not just about preventing disruptions anymore.
So what is it about?
Putting a hard number on potential financial losses from these risks,
Yeah.
quantifying it,
Why is that so important in finance?
regulations mainly. Frameworks like the Basel Accords, that's for banks, and the Solvency II. Directive for European insurance companies, they mandate holding capital reserves to cover these potential operational losses, especially after the 2008 financial crisis.
To make sure they can take a hit, right?
Exactly, a financial safety net.
Huh.
Capital adequacy regulations under Basel, for instance, require banks to factor in operational risk when calculating their capital reserves.
So they're not underestimating their risks.
Right. Solvency II does something similar for insurers. So basically, operational risks are the same for banks as for other companies, but they have to quantify it for the regulators.
Got it.
Even the Basel framework defines it: the risk of loss from inadequate or failed processes, people, systems, or external events.
And that includes legal risks, but not strategic or reputational ones.
That's right.
Okay, so what would those be for banks? What kind of specific risks?
Well, Basel breaks them down into several areas: internal fraud, think someone within the bank stealing,
Right.
external fraud hacking attempts. Then there are employment practices, damage to physical assets, business interruptions, and just plain failures in execution or process management.
Those sound pretty broad.
They are, but the article groups them further: people risks, process risks, system risks, and external risks. It helps get a better picture of where these risks come from.
Okay, so they exclude strategic and reputational risk from that Basel definition. How do those differ in practice?
Good question. Strategic risk is all about the big picture decisions. how the organization competes.
Right, the direction they're going.
Exactly. Reputational risk is about negative public opinion, the potential damage there.
Okay.
Operational risk is more about the day-to-day running of things.
Okay, that makes sense. The article mentions market risk and credit risk as well. Where do those fit in?
Market risk is pretty straightforward. It's about losing money because of changes in market prices.
Like interest rates going up or down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or the stock market taking a dive.
Right.
Credit risk is when someone who owes you money doesn't pay it back.
Like a loan default.
Right. And for insurance companies, there's also underwriting risk. That's about how well they assess the risks when they're issuing insurance policies.
Okay, so that's a whole other category of risk.
Operational risk is different from all of those, but the article makes a really good point. Sometimes what looks like a market risk loss can actually be traced back to operational failures.
Ah, interesting. Give me an example.
Think of those rogue traders we hear about.
Yeah, the ones who lose a ton of money.
Right. It might seem like it's just the market moving against them.
Right.
But if the operational controls had been stronger, those traders probably wouldn't have been able to do what they did.
So it's not just the market's fault, it's a failure of the systems meant to manage that risk.
Exactly.
Okay, so the Basel framework doesn't just define operational risk, it also outlines principles for managing it. I think the article listed 12.
It does. They're pretty comprehensive. It's a solid guide for banks, especially that first principle. The board of directors, those at the top, have to be the driving force behind a strong risk management culture. And then senior management puts that into action, setting the tone from the top down.
That makes sense.
Otherwise, it's tough to build that culture throughout the organization.
Right. So what are some of the other key principles they highlight?
Well, Principle 2 says banks need a really solid operational risk management framework, integrated into their overall risk management.
Okay.
And it has to be tailored to the bank's size, how complex they are, and their specific risk profile. That's Principle 3.
So it has to fit them specifically.
Exactly. And the board has to approve this framework and keep checking on it, making sure it's actually happening.
So the board sets it up, senior management executes it, and it's got to be a good fit for the bank. What about deciding how much risk is okay?
Principle 4 tackles that. The board has to approve a risk appetite statement and review it regularly, of course. That sets out the level of operational risk they're comfortable with.
All right, their limits. So what's Principle 5 about?
Principle 5 is all about governance. Senior management has to create a clear structure, defining who's responsible for what when it comes to managing operational risk, making sure it aligns with that risk appetite we talked about.
So everyone knows who's doing what.
Exactly. Everyone knows their role.
Mhm.
Principle 6 and 7 then dive into actually identifying and assessing risks, looking at all the products, activities, processes, systems, everything, and they emphasize managing change within the bank.
Which happens all the time, I imagine.
All the time. And then there's monitoring. Principle 8, regularly checking the bank's operational risk profile. How exposed are they? And reporting systems for the board, senior management, everyone needs to be in the loop.
So transparency across the board.
Exactly. What about controls, safeguards?
Yeah, what about those?
Principle 9 covers that. Banks need a strong control environment. Policies, processes, systems, checks and balances, everything to reduce or transfer risk.
Okay.
And Principle 10 is all about technology because banks rely on it so heavily, having a solid ICT risk management program.
That's information and communication technology, right?
Right. And that has to fit into their overall operational risk framework.
It's a big one these days, cybersecurity and all that.
Absolutely. Now, what happens when there's a major disruption?
That's a good question. Does Basel address that?
It does in Principle 11. Banks need business continuity plans, ways to keep operating and minimize losses, even when facing big disruptions. And these plans have to be connected to their overall risk management framework.
Okay, so they're prepared for the worst.
As prepared as they can be. Finally, Principle 12 is about being open about all of this. Public disclosure should give everyone a good understanding of how they're managing operational risk.
Transparency again. So these 12 principles really lay the groundwork for effective operational risk management in banks. The article also mentions Basel II and Basel III. What are those exactly?
Those are big international sets of rules developed by the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision.
Okay.
The goal, a stronger global banking system. They focus on capital adequacy, risk management, and liquidity, making sure banks have enough money to cover losses, managing their risks well, and having enough easily accessible assets to meet their obligations.
So Basel II came first. What were the key parts of that framework?
It had three pillars. The first, minimum capital requirements, laid out how much capital banks need to hold for credit risk, market risk, and operational risk.
Okay.
It also allowed for more sophisticated internal models to calculate risk. Pillar two, the supervisory review process, gave regulators more power to check up on banks and demand more capital if needed.
More oversight.
Exactly. And pillar three, market discipline, was all about transparency. Banks have to share key information about their risks and capital.
Okay, so that sets the stage for Basel III.
Right.
And that was a response to the 2008 financial crisis, right? Tightening things up.
Exactly. Basel III aimed to fix the holes that the crisis revealed. It ramped up the minimum capital requirements, especially that core equity Tier 1 capital, the best quality kinds.
More of a cushion.
Right. It also added new capital buffers, just an extra layer of protection. And then there's a leverage ratio, preventing banks from borrowing too much, and new liquidity standards, the LCR and the NSFR, to ensure they have enough liquid assets. It also improved risk coverage and added requirements for those systemically important banks, the ones that are too big to fail.
So Basel III really tightened the screws when it came to capital and liquidity.
It did.
What are the biggest differences between Basel II and III? The key takeaways.
The article sums it up well. Higher capital requirements and those new buffers I mentioned.
Okay.
Basel III also added the leverage and liquidity ratios, which weren't in Basel II, and a bigger focus on systemic risks, making sure those big interconnected banks are more resilient.
So a much tougher stance after the 2008 crisis.
Definitely.
Now back to operational risks specifically. Basel provides different ways for banks to calculate that regulatory capital they need to hold, right?
Yeah, there are three main approaches. Each one gets progressively more detailed. There's the basic indicator approach, the simplest one. It uses a single indicator, usually a percentage of their income, to estimate their risk.
Okay.
Then there's the standardized approach, a bit more refined. It uses financial indicators along with the bank's past operational losses.
Okay.
And the most complex one is the advanced approach. Banks can use their internal data and statistical models to calculate their capital needs. It's important to note that these methods have varying levels of accuracy.
So some are more precise than others.
Right, it's like different levels of detail in budgeting. The basic approach is just a rough estimate. The standardized approach uses more data. And the advanced approach is like a custom-built financial model. More accurate, but also more complex.
Okay, that makes sense. The article also mentions some of the challenges in measuring operational risk. It doesn't sound straightforward.
It's definitely not. One of the biggest problems is the lack of data, especially for those big but rare operational loss events.
The kind that can really hurt.
Exactly. And even quantifying some operational risks, like reputational damage, that's really tricky. But banks have noticed a correlation. Bigger banks, often measured by number of employees, tend to have bigger potential losses. And the number of losses is often linked to the number of customers they have.
So size does matter in this case. To illustrate this, the article gives some examples of operational risk events categorized by type. Can you walk us through some of those?
Sure. Let's start with internal fraud. There's unauthorized activities, theft, and various kinds of fraud.
So bad stuff happening within the bank itself.
Right. Think unreported or unapproved transactions, actual theft of assets, not complying with tax rules, even insider trading.
Okay, serious stuff. What about fraud from the outside?
External fraud. That's about the security of their systems. Things like robbery, forgery, hacking, data theft. All those fall under external fraud.
Makes sense.
Then there are risks from employees themselves. Injuries, violations of employment laws, those can lead to compensation claims or accusations of discrimination.
So risks that come from within the workforce.
Right. And then there are clients, failing to meet professional obligations to them, not acting in their best interest, not disclosing things properly, misusing confidential information. Those are big risks too.
That's a wide range of potential problems. What about the bank's physical assets and systems?
Right, so physical assets, that's about losses from damage to buildings.
Okay.
Natural disasters, terrorism, vandalism. Those are the risks there. Systems, that focuses on disruptions from hardware or software failures, problems with telecommunications, utility services, those kinds of things.
It's all connected these days.
It is. And finally, processes. Losses from errors in processing transactions, managing processes,
Okay.
data entry errors, missing deadlines, failing to meet reporting requirements, inaccurate records, those fall under that category.
Wow, so many ways things can go wrong.
There are. But it shows you how many different types of operational risks banks have to consider.
Definitely. The article then compares operational risk in financial companies and industrial companies. What are the key differences there?
Both types face operational risk, but the nature of those risks, how they're measured and how they're managed, those often differ because what they do is so different.
Right.
Financial companies focus on quantifying risk for capital and dealing with the risks of financial activities,
Yeah.
trading, lending, things like that. Industrial companies, on the other hand, tend to prioritize preventing tangible hazards.
Like equipment breaking down or safety incidents.
Right. And making sure their physical operations and supply chains are running smoothly.
Okay, so a bank is worried about a data breach, and a manufacturing company is worried about a machine breaking down and halting production.
Basically.
Hmm.
And the article has a table that really highlights the differences. For example, errors in finance often happen because people reach their mental limits dealing with complex systems. But in industry, errors are more often due to physical limitations in environments that are easier to manage.
Makes sense.
In finance, preventing loss is about predicting value in assets. In industry, it's more about safety, preventing accidents, or faulty products. And the reasons behind mistakes can also differ. In finance, it might be the lure of personal gain.
Okay.
In industry, it might be cutting corners, even sabotage. And finally, risk management is central to the core operations of a financial institution.
Makes sense.
In industrial companies, it's important, but not as tightly tied to the day-to-day production processes.
Interesting distinctions. The article points out that interest in operational risk has really grown, especially in finance, because of this need to quantify it. But it also says it's not easy to measure accurately.
It's a tough one. Even if you can estimate how likely a loss is, putting a number on the financial impact, that's really hard.
Right.
There are statistical methods, but no one agreed upon a way to do it. And the article makes a good point. The costs of operational risks go beyond just direct financial losses.
Well, what else is there?
Think about indirect costs, losing customers, the future revenue they would brought in.
Okay, so it can snowball. And to manage these risks, strong internal controls and audits are key.
Right, in both financial and industrial sectors, absolutely.
But isn't it harder to control behavior in finance? The stakes are so high, and there's that potential for personal gain.
That's what the article suggests, yeah.
Yeah.
Controlling employee behavior is more complex in finance than in manufacturing. But the article also says that measuring operational risk isn't just for financial institutions. They give the example of a transport company.
Oh.
They have to assess all sorts of risks: fluctuating fuel prices, changes in taxes, errors in deliveries, accidents, delays, all that,
And they have to put a number on those risks.
to prioritize their efforts, to figure out where to focus their control measures.
So really, all organizations should be thinking about this, not just banks and financial firms.
That's the point, yeah. For some, it's about protecting their physical assets and having insurance.
Yeah.
For others, it's about those capital reserves. But the principles apply across the board. And while risk management training is common in financial institutions, and standards like ISO 31000 are being adopted, the article warns against treating operational risk quantification as just a box-ticking exercise.
So not just going through the motions.
Right, it needs to be a part of the culture. Managers at all levels need to own the risks they're responsible for, raising awareness, quantifying potential losses, educating everyone. That's what leads to cost-effective risk management, and ultimately better results for the organization.
Okay, I'm with you. The article then gives an example of how a group risk department sees operational risk. What kind of risks did they identify?
They listed 5 main ones. People risk, that's about getting and keeping the right talent.
Okay.
Process risk, meaning failures in how things are done, or weak controls. Then there's technology risk, failing to invest in and implement the right technology.
Keeping up with the times, basically.
Right. And then cyber risk, so financial loss, data breaches, disruptions, reputational damage from IT system failures.
That one's huge these days.
It is. And finally, customer outcome risk.
Okay, what's that?
When products, processes, or services don't meet the expectations of customers or regulators.
So failing to deliver what you promised,
Exactly.
that gives you a sense of how broad operational risk really is. The article then gives some real-world examples from oil and gas and finance. Let's start with oil and gas, specifically offshore drilling. How do they handle operational risk?
This example really shows how risky that industry is, especially offshore. They identified key risks, like equipment failure, human error, bad weather, and environmental hazards. Think oil spills.
Right, high stakes.
They looked at how likely these events were and their potential impact. For mitigation, they had preventive maintenance, thorough training, monitoring systems, contingency plans for emergencies, and weather monitoring
So being prepared for everything.
as much as possible.
Yeah.
And they emphasize continuous monitoring and evaluation of their risk management practices. If there was an incident, like an oil spill, they had detailed response plans in place and then a continuous improvement process to learn from it.
Always learning. Okay, what about the financial example? They focused on preventing fraud in online banking.
Right. They focused on risks like unauthorized access, fraudulent transactions, and reputational damage from data breaches.
Okay.
They assessed the likelihood and impact of each risk. Their strategies included strong user authentication, things like two-factor authentication and biometrics.
Okay.
Then enhancing cybersecurity with firewalls, encryption, using AI for fraud monitoring, and customer awareness campaigns.
Educating the users.
Exactly. They also stressed continuous system monitoring, penetration testing to find vulnerabilities, ongoing employee training on security, and having a solid incident response plan. Plus, a thorough analysis of any incidents to constantly improve their risk management.
Sounds like a comprehensive approach.
It is. Both of these examples really emphasize the importance of a systematic and adaptable approach to operational risk management, and it has to be tailored to the specific industry.
Every industry has its unique challenges. Okay, let's move on to the second big area. Project risk management. What's the core idea here?
Project risk management. It's a structured process for identifying, analyzing, and addressing those risks that could prevent a project from hitting its goals.
So staying on budget, on schedule, delivering the quality you need.
Exactly. It's about being proactive, minimizing disruptions, maximizing opportunities.
Looking ahead, basically. What could go wrong? What could go right?
You got it. The steps are identify all the risks, assess how likely they are and what impact they could have, develop response strategies avoiding the risk, mitigating it, transferring it, or accepting it, and then continuous monitoring and communication.
So staying on top of things, how does this fit into the bigger picture of ERM?
It's all connected. Project risk management should align with the organization's overall risk appetite and strategic objectives.
Okay.
Projects are often how organizations implement changes or improve operations. So managing risks at the project level supports the risk management goals of the entire organization.
It makes sense, but the article also distinguishes between managing risks within a project and those about the project's purpose and benefits. Can you explain that?
Sure. Typically, project risk management focuses on successful delivery. On time, on budget, meeting those specifications and quality standards.
Okay, the nuts and bolts of getting it done.
But there's also the bigger question. Is this project actually going to deliver? Will it achieve the intended benefits? Is it the right way to go about things strategically?
So you're not just building a bridge, you're asking if that bridge is actually useful and the best way to connect those 2 points.
Exactly. You have to consider the project's fundamental justification. Project risk management is really an extension of project planning. You have deadlines, budgets, quality goals. Risk, in this case, is anything that could cause the project to deviate from those goals.
Okay.
Because you want predictability, control. The goal is to reduce variability as much as possible and manage those potential disruptions.
I see. And the main way to do that is through control management.
Right. Putting in place processes and actions that address the risks and keep the project on track.
But it's not just about preventing things from going wrong, is it? The article also talks about looking for opportunities.
Absolutely. It's not just about avoiding the potholes. It's about speeding up if the road is unexpectedly clear. You're looking for those unexpected positives and adjusting the plan to take advantage of them.
Okay, that makes sense. What about those really big projects, like the Olympics? The article mentions how some factors can have a huge impact.
Right. Things like ground conditions at construction sites or unexpected contamination, those could blow up your timeline and budget.
I can imagine.
Identifying and managing those uncertainties early on is crucial.
So, in a way, a project is a risk reduction strategy in itself.
That's one way to look at it. You're aiming to achieve specific objectives, create business advantages, deliver value. And project risk management is a well-established field. There are a lot of tools and techniques out there to control risks and manage those unexpected events. The goal is always successful completion, on budget, on time, meeting those quality standards.
Makes sense. But every project is unique in some ways, so just relying on historical data for risk assessment might not be enough, right?
That's a key point. Historical data can help, but projects often involve new technology, unique teams, different environments.
So you can't just rely on what happened before.
Right. Project risk management needs to be forward-looking. anticipating potential issues that might not have been encountered before. And the article lists the different types of risks that need to be addressed.
Right. Compliance risks, hazard risks, control risks, and opportunity risks. Can you briefly explain each one?
Sure. Compliance risks are about getting all the necessary permissions, approvals, regulations, making sure you're doing everything by the book.
Dotting your I's and crossing your T's.
Exactly. Hazard risks are things that could cause delays or increase costs. Control risks are about potential problems with the project's specs, performance, or quality. And opportunity risks, those are the positive developments that could benefit the project.
So, looking at both sides of the coin.
Right. Both the downsides and the potential upsides. And then the article talks about different approaches to handling uncertainty in projects.
Okay, how do you deal with all that?
There are 4 main approaches. First, accepting the risk and proceeding as planned, especially if the impact is likely low. Second, adapting your activities and procedures to manage the risk, reduce its likelihood or impact.
Okay.
Third, adopting contingency plans, having backup strategies ready to go if the risk occurs. And fourth, avoiding the risk altogether, maybe by changing the project plan or dropping a specific part of it.
So, multiple options depending on the situation.
Right. The best response often depends on the potential impact of the risk and how uncertain it is. The article provides a guideline. If the impact and uncertainty are both low, you might just accept it. High impact, low uncertainty, you might adapt your plans or consider insurance. Low impact, high uncertainty, contingency plans are probably a good idea. And if it's both high impact and highly uncertain, avoidance might be best.
A framework for making those tough decisions. The article also mentions a risk matrix, using time delays and cost increases to categorize risks.
Right. That's a great visual tool. It helps you see which risks are in the comfort zone, the cautious zone, the concern zone, or the critical zone based on their potential impact.
Okay.
And the likelihood of the risk happening is often represented by the size of a bubble on the matrix. So you quickly see which risks need immediate attention.
That's a helpful visual. The London Olympics construction facing the global financial crisis is a good example, a major unforeseen event.
Right. But more commonly, it's things like poor ground conditions, a classic construction risk.
You always have to be prepared for the unexpected. What about the bow tie model? What's that all about?
It's a way to visualize the entire project life cycle from start to finish. The knot of the bow tie represents the uncertainties. And it shows how controls can be implemented throughout the project to reduce those uncertainties, manage them, and limit their impact on quality, cost, time, and compliance.
So it's a reminder that risk management is an ongoing process.
Exactly. Not just something you do once and forget about. The article then talks about the project risk register. Why is that so important?
Yeah, what's that all about?
It's a formal document, but it's also dynamic. It's the central place for recording, tracking, and managing all those potential risks throughout the project.
Okay.
It's where you document each risk, assess how likely it is and what impact it could have, and then you prioritize them.
So the most dangerous ones get the most attention.
Exactly. The register also details the response strategies for each risk, who's responsible, and the current status of each risk. It's important because it gives everyone a clear view of the threats and opportunities, it drives proactive planning, keeps everyone informed, and helps keep the project on track.
Okay, sounds like an essential tool, and the article even gives an example of what it might look like.
Right. You'd have columns for a risk ID, a description of the risk, its category, its likelihood, its impact, the overall risk level, the mitigation actions, who's responsible, and its status. Like delay in receiving critical materials, that might be a high likelihood, medium impact risk, so overall high risk.
Okay.
The mitigation might be ordering early and finding backup suppliers. The procurement team would be responsible, and its status would be open, actively monitored.
Having that organized information all in one place is critical. The article also discusses the project life cycle and how risk management fits into each stage.
Right. The project life cycle is usually broken down into inception, planning, execution, and closure. And the article says ERM principles should be integrated into every single stage.
So you're always thinking about risk.
From day one,
Mhm.
in the inception phase, you're defining the project scope, identifying high-level risks, making sure it aligns with the organization's risk appetite. Planning is about developing the roadmap, doing those detailed risk assessments, creating mitigation strategies, and building that risk register we talked about. Execution focuses on monitoring and managing the identified risks as you go, adapting to changes, dealing with emerging risks, leveraging opportunities, and keeping everyone in the loop.
So staying flexible and communicative.
Exactly. And then
A closure.
you review the risks, how effective the mitigation efforts were, and capture lessons learned for future projects.
So even at the end, you're still learning.
Always, integrating ERM principles throughout the project lifecycle helps minimize threats and maximize opportunities.
Okay. The article mentions that project risk management is a really well-regarded area, especially for fast-paced projects, from software to stadiums. It reiterates those 4 stages: inception, planning, execution, closure, and emphasizes the client's needs and expectations.
Right, those are always front and center. Understanding the life cycle helps you plan and align the risk management steps appropriately. And while project risk management follows that general process, its framework has to be dynamic. Projects are always evolving.
You can't just stick to a rigid plan.
Exactly. And each stage has its own risks. Clearly defining the project, setting realistic timelines and budgets, making sure the final product meets the specs of those books, those all have their own uncertainties. You need to be prepared to handle changes, updates, deviations.
Makes sense. There's a figure in the article about uncertainty in projects. What point does that illustrate?
It shows that uncertainty is highest at the beginning of a project and gradually decreases as it progresses.
So you have the most unknowns at the start?
Exactly. But it also shows that while uncertainty goes down, the cost of making changes goes up as the project goes on.
Ah, so you need to catch those risks early.
Exactly. When you still have flexibility and changes are cheaper. The article also mentions expanding the traditional project triangle of cost, time, and quality.
What do they mean by that?
Many organizations are adding a fourth element: compliance or sustainability, often grouped under quality or performance.
Okay.
They use the example of a flat refurbishment with multiple stakeholders: architects, contractors, regulators, utility providers all involved.
That sounds complicated.
It can be. It highlights the need for integrated risk management, clearly defining who's responsible for what, prioritizing risks, developing response plans, keeping that risk register updated, monitoring everything.
So keeping everyone on the same page. Expert speaker.